Good morning or afternoon, whenever you are watching this interview. I'm Kendra Albright, and I'm the instructor for KM 61095, the Issues and Trends in Knowledge Management. And we're here today with Stan Garfield, who is the godfather of KM, as he is known to some. And we are so fortunate to have him here today. And he's going to talk with us about community management today. Before we start talking about community management, however, I'd like for Stan to tell us a little bit about your background, how you got into KM, and just sort of your history about yourself. So let's let the class know who you are. Thanks.
Thanks, Kendra. I'm glad to be here with you. It's interesting, the field of knowledge management has really only been called that for perhaps roughly the last 30 years. But we've done it for longer than that. In fact, if I go back and ask the question, where did I get my start in it? Probably when I was young, when I was in elementary school, I actually liked to go and share things. I remember going to the blackboard in elementary school and I would write like a news item or a piece of information of the day. No one asked me to do that. I'm not sure anybody actually read it, but that gives you a little bit of idea that I was always sort of interested in sharing something that I thought others might be interested in. And as time went along and I got into high school, I got interested in journalism. I actually operated my own radio stations, which weren't exactly legal at the time, but nonetheless, I had this desire to share things with the world. And eventually, when I was a senior in high school, I decided that's the career that I wanted to pursue, was journalism. So I actually applied to journalism school, and I got into the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern, which is one of the renowned schools of journalism anywhere. And I was pretty certain that was going to be my career. I was probably most interested in radio journalism, but I also liked to write. So when I got there, I actually took a class that had been recommended me as a way of fulfilling my science requirement, which was Introduction to Computer Science. And I really didn't have any interest in that, but it sounded like something I could fulfill that requirement with my freshman year. And lo and behold, I actually liked computer science a lot. I found myself one day writing a computer program for fun, and I realized if I was doing that, I must actually like this. So I ended up switching from my journalism major, and I transferred from Northwestern University to Washington University, where I was from in St. Louis, and into the School of Engineering and majored in applied mathematics and computer science. So I ended up with technical training and I became a computer programmer in my initial job, but I still had that kind of interest in journalism in my background. And it didn't really come into play that much at first. But later on, when I went to work at Digital Equipment Corporation, which was now 40 years ago, if you can believe that,
Yeah.
those two things eventually came together. As I was managing teams of people at Digital, I found that I would like to find information for them that they needed. I'd go off and try to find it. I used to write things up for them. I tried to ultimately build knowledge sharing documents and newsletters and things of that kind. We didn't call it knowledge management. I always had some job that I did leading teams of consultants. But in the process of doing that, I would try to find things that they needed in order to better do their jobs. And one interesting example was something called the key contacts list. This is something that I created originally for my team so they could figure out who in Digital they should contact for a particular need. Digital was a large company at the time. They actually reached at their peak 135,000 employees. And knowing whom to contact for what, who was in charge of this product or who could be responsible for technical support on this. I went off and tried to figure that out. And I built this list, which was essentially the org chart of Digital, which didn't exist anywhere. So I built that and I would call up people and I'd say, can you tell me who's in your department and who reports to whom and what their titles are, what they're responsible for. And eventually I had this large document that I sent out to my team. And I figured it was just a useful tool for them. Well, what happening is that document got forwarded all around Digital through email. And I would receive it periodically being forwarded to me saying, look at this. This is the yellow pages of Digital. It's very important. So I realized that this was something people needed. So it was an early example of, providing people with some basic information, who did what, who reported to whom. And that was sort of one of the early examples of knowledge management before we called it that. Then I was trying to find ways to share documents like this in a way that you didn't have to send them out explicitly through email. And early on at Digital, we had some pretty good networking capabilities. So you could store things and share them across the network, but it was somewhat cumbersome. You'd have to give out a fairly lengthy network address, and someone would have to type in an operating system command to transfer the file. But that's what we had. And then later we had an office automation tool called All-in-One, and it added a functionality called shared file cabinet, where I could put something in the file cabinet and someone could more easily retrieve it from there. And I thought, this is great. Now I could post my newsletters there, and people can come and get them. And then finally, the internet and the intranet came to be. So it's hard to imagine a time before they existed, but definitely didn't exist when I first started working at Digital. So when the internet came along, I just thought this was great. Now there was a place I could post things, people could go and find them. It was easy to use, didn't involve lengthy command strings. So then that was a great thing. And at this point, then I started to really make use of that. And I was recognized at Digital as somebody who liked to share their knowledge. So in 1996, I was approached by the vice president who was in charge of the consulting business at Digital. And he asked me if I would go with him. He was going to go visit Ernst & Young in Cleveland at their Center for Business Knowledge, and they were going to pitch him on knowledge management. And he thought, since I was somebody that did this kind of stuff, that I should come along. So I did. We had a real interesting visit there. We saw what Ernst & Young were doing. I was very envious of what they were doing. And the vice president turned to me and he said, I'm leaving now, but I want you to be in charge of this. And they said they had a chief knowledge officer at Ernst & Young. And he said, I want you to be that for us here at Digital. So I thought, great. I was sort of surprised that he was leaving in midday, leaving my own, but okay, I went from there. And I ended up launching the first knowledge management program at Digital in 1996. And then I've been doing it full time ever since. So along the way, that combination of computer science training and journalism turned out to be a really good combination for knowledge management, because it's really important for us to be able to communicate effectively, but it's also important that we understand the underlying technology that we use. And so having that background has served me well. And I always recommend to people in knowledge management that the more different things you have in your background, the better. Having just one thing, if you were just a programmer, that's not as good as someone who also communicates, and vice versa. So along the way, I've started up several different knowledge management programs, including at Digital and at Compaq and at Hewlett Packard. And then I left eventually to go to Deloitte, where I was in charge of communities for Deloitte. So retired from Deloitte in 2016, but still stay very active in the field, in writing and speaking and leading community. So that's sort of the long-winded version of my background.
Let me follow up with just a quick question about the community that you manage. Can you tell a little bit about SICM? I think the students would be interested.
Yes, it's called the Systems Integration Knowledge Management, or SIKM, Leaders Community. It was started in 2005. I think I was presenting for the first time at a conference in 2005 at the APQC Knowledge Management Conference that was held that year in St. Louis. And I was presenting there, and they asked me as a presenter if I would host what they called a birds of a feather lunch. So they put up these tables for lunch for all the attendees at the conference, and then we were asked for a topic. They printed up a sign, and I stuck that sign in the center of my round table, and it said systems integration and consulting firms. So I was supposedly going to attract the people who were at the conference who worked for those kinds of companies. So I was doing systems integration and consulting knowledge management at the time at Hewlett Packard, and other people from other companies like that came and sat down at the table. We had a nice discussion at lunch. And at the end of that, I said to everyone, would you like to continue the conversation? And everybody said yes. I said, well, hand me your business cards and we'll start up something. So that was the origin of it. I got their business cards. So there were like 8 of us at the table. And that was the origin of the community. And then later, talking to one of my colleagues, he found this interesting, and he actually created a Yahoo group for us to use and gave it the name SIKM. That's where the name came from. We soon realized that we didn't need to limit it to people working in systems integration. It could be for anyone, but the name stuck. So today people will call it SICM, or they misspell it as skim, or they'll call it SIKM. If you say it too fast, they can't follow what you're saying, but it doesn't really mean anything anymore. It's just like APQC once meant the American Productivity and Quality Center, but now
Right.
they just call it APQC. Same thing, we're just SIKM, and it's a brand that has stuck. And that community, then I started going and asking people that I knew if they wanted to join it. So we grew from 8 to 16 and so forth. We just kept adding people. And if anybody was interested in the field, the only requirement was you had to be interested in the field, and you had to then be willing to join the community and follow what we were discussing. And so it took off from there. And now we're over 1,100 members, and we've steadily grown since then. And we've had a monthly call every month since we formed. So that's 18 years now that we've been in existence. And it's really one of the only large scale global communities for knowledge management that's left. There's another one called KM4Dev, which is about the same size and also has online discussions and has events. So we're kind of similar, but that one is focused more on the development community, and ours is more generally available to anyone. So anyone who's in your class that's interested in knowledge management can join this community. They can participate in the online discussions. They can attend the monthly calls. And one of the nice things is the entire history of the community is still available online. We've had to migrate from the original Yahoo group to a new platform called groups.io, but all of our discussions dating all the way back are still there. All of the monthly calls, the recordings, the slides, everything is still there. So over 200 of those monthly calls later, there's a lot there that you can go back and take advantage of.
You can get your degree just by reading, listening to the calls and reading all the resources you have on your webpage. So I'm going to make sure that the students have access to that, how to do that, and your resource page, which is wonderful. And I hate to tell them that secretly they could just go read everything on your page and they're done. I use it
Takes a
often.
while.
I use it often. I was actually talking with my daughter this morning about the organization she works for, and she had a whole lot of questions. I handed her my PowerPoint notes from your presentation, your workshop at KM World this year, and she goes, "That's it. That's it. That's what I need." So it's a really wonderful resource. You're a wonderful resource for everyone, and you've been, the connector for so much of what goes on in KM, forever. So, thanks for all the good work that you've been doing. And I'll make sure the students get copies of how links and how to get to SICM or SIKM, however you prefer to say it. It does
Right,
kind of SICM, it's like SICM.
right. Whatever works for you, we're happy
That's
with.
right. Go get them. Go get them. All right. Well, at this point, what I'd really like to do is to turn the attention now to your views on community management, because I think that this is, you have several books on this topic, of which I have quite a few of them on my bookshelf, and I have read them, and they are wonderful books. And you are like a ballet dancer. You make everything look so easy and so simple when you explain it. So I'd really like for you to just kind of go through that process and whatever you want to talk about with the students so they have an idea about what it is really all about.
Sure. So when I joined digital in 1983, 40 years ago, one of the things that I was impressed to find out is they had communities of practice at that time. I don't think we used that term. We called them Vax Notes conferences, but they were in fact thriving online threaded discussions for all the important topics that affected digital, not only work related, but non-work related. And that was an important principle, that we were so interested in making sure that people were comfortable using communities that we encouraged them to form not just for work related topics, but you could have them for the ski club, or you could have them for the photography club. And that encouraged everyone at digital to be comfortable with using this tool, with the idea of how you used it to collaborate with other people who were interested in the same topic. And it was the norm at digital at the time that if you had a question about a particular topic, you were supposed to go and look for the threaded discussion or Vax Notes conference on that topic, search through it first to see if the question had already been answered. And if not, then you'd post your question to that community and you'd get an answer. And that was something that was a norm for digital. And it's a shame that digital sort of lost that along the way, because that's really a model that every organization should follow, that communities are core to how we interact. They connect all the people who have a shared interest, whether or not they already know each other, and they exist to allow people to learn together about the topic, to answer questions for each other, to solve problems together, to innovate together. There's all these benefits that come from it. But at the core, it's the idea that by threading together everyone who has either a same job, the same role, the same interest, the same specialty, the same passion, the same set of problems, the things that unite them, we then strengthen ourselves through those connections. And the larger an organization is, the more this is valuable. If you work for a small team and only has 5 people and then you all sit in the same room, well, then you're going to be relatively aware of each other and what each other has done and what they know, and you can just talk to each other right there. But as the organization gets larger and larger and spread across the world, that's not possible. So at a company like Digital, where there are over 100,000 employees all over the world, there was no way for anyone to know who all the other people were out there that might be able to help them or share their interests. So Vax Notes Conference has made that possible. So I sort of at a very early stage of my corporate career saw this and realized the power of it. And then it fell right into my idea of how we should be sharing with each other. So when I started that first knowledge management program at Digital, communities certainly seemed like a logical part of it, a very fundamental part of it. And so we really emphasize that. And to this day, I tell people if they're starting a knowledge management program, that's really going to be one of the things you would probably start with, right? If you had to pick out of all the many things that you could do, that would be the one that almost would guarantee with the results that would be positive. So, in fact, I've offered to debate anyone, if you wanted to pick one thing to do in knowledge management, what would you pick? I would pick communities, and I'd let anyone pick something else, and I would be glad to debate with them why I thought mine would be more valuable. So what does a community consist of? It consists of people. One of the things that you make a mistake of in our field is we get enamored of technology, and sometimes people would refer to other things as communities, talking about the platform or the tool, but that's just something that's an enabler. The people are the community, and they use tools to connect with each other, and those tools can be very valuable. But make sure you start with the community. You can actually have a community that has no tools at all, right? If the people just meet, they can still be a successful community. And as they get distributed geographically, you need tools in order to make it easier for them to connect. So if you start with that, people who have something in common that they want to come together and do better together with, then you go from there. Usually you're going to build some kind of way for them to interact. And there are plenty of tools out there that support that. At Digital, we had the notes conferences. Later on, there were other tools we used, but I found it doesn't really matter much about what tool. There's always going to be something that you can find that you may already have in your organization, and you just figure out how to use that. You don't have to go out and buy the best tool. Just use whatever you have and just figure out a way to build communities from there. So then, as I went through my career in knowledge management, it became more and more clear to me that even though the idea of communities was widespread, the effective use of them was not. And so communities often go off in the wrong direction. And I certainly encountered that a number of times in my career where companies would say they wanted to have communities, but then when you looked at what they were actually doing, they weren't really doing them the way that's effective.
Uh-huh.
And so that led me to create something called the Communities Manifesto, which was me writing down some principles that I felt were important, but I often saw not being followed. And among those principles were things like the communities have to be voluntary, that you can't force someone to be in a community. That won't work. They have to choose to be in one and choose to spend some of their time and attention on them. And that they should be on the topics that matter to the members, not that the topics that matter to the company, right? So if you work for a company and it sets up communities that are modeled after their org structure or modeled after their products or their services, that's not as good as if they're modeled after things that the people identify with. So I've often talked about an example where one of the companies I worked for, they wanted to name communities based on the service offerings that company had.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt that was the wrong idea. It should be based on terms that we all recognize and relate to and that are more timeless. So in one case, they had something they called program integration management. That was a service offering at that particular time. I'm sure it didn't exist, 6 months later, but at that time it did. And they wanted to have a community called that. And I said, no one will identify with that. If you want to find people to join the community, what will they likely call themselves? They'll call themselves project managers.
Mm-hmm.
So you should have a project management community And then if you change the name of your service offering, you don't have to change the name of the community. People will understand what that is and identify with it and choose to join it because that's the way they see themselves. So one of the principles is it has to be a term that people recognize. You try to make one that's timeless, not that will keep changing. And you want one that people look at and say, yeah, that's me. I want to meet other people like me who do that thing. And so those, there was 10 of these principles in the community's manifesto that you can refer to. But it captured many of these concepts that, communities are people, not tools. Communities span boundaries. They connect people who don't work in the same team. That's really the purpose of them. And in some companies, they actually thought differently. They thought communities should be the same as org units.
Yeah.
Work in this team, then I'm in that, in that community.
So let me just follow up with a question about project
Sure.
management since you brought that up.
Yeah.
So if you are establishing COPs, would you ever have would you set up COPs for project teams? It sounds like not, that you might have a COP just for the project managers to kind of share their ideas and what's working and what's not. Is that right?
Right. That's one of the principles in the community's manifesto is that communities are not teams. Now, it's important for teams to collaborate. So I'm not saying that that isn't true, but it's a different kind of collaboration. The team comes together for that particular project, and it lasts only for the duration of the project. And then they go off to the next project with a different team. So they need to collaborate during that project, and they can use some of the same tools that communities could use. But the difference is they're not on that project because they chose to be necessarily, they've been assigned to it, and
Right.
they'll stop collaborating with those people when they move on to the next one. But in a community, you generally don't stop being interested in your specialty. You stay in that for as long as that's your specialty. So the difference is you wouldn't form communities for project teams, but you would want there to be communities for the things that the project team members specialize in. So the project manager should be in the project management community, and the members of the teams may bring different specialties and skills. Someone may be a networking specialist, someone may be a security specialist, somebody may be a software developer. They should all belong to communities for those specialties. So therefore, I talked about boundary spanning, the communities span boundaries. Each one of those team members will be in different communities, but they'll bring then the collective power of all those communities to bear on the project. So if I have 5 members of the project team, the project manager gets expertise from other project managers and help them do that job better. And the network specialist gets support from other network specialists in other projects and so forth. So you bring the full power of your organization to bear, not just that of the people in the team. And that's really where I think a lot of organizations go wrong. They don't see the power of boundary spanning, meaning cutting across organizational boundaries and bringing together people who otherwise wouldn't be connected. And that's an important benefit of communities.
Yeah, it's you're creating like a grid of communication that's not just going up and down the hierarchical structure, but across. That's a really great idea. I did some research on how AIDS information in Uganda helped reverse the prevalence of the disease when they were so successful through behavior change, and that's how they did it. They created that grid horizontally through the public information processes like radio and drama and stuff, and then also vertically through the government structures. So that makes a lot of sense. It's the way that you process information and knowledge. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
That is really cool. By the way, I'm going to put a plug in. Oh, I've got my blur on. I'm going to tell you guys, there, I almost had it. There we go. Handbook of Community Management by Stan Garfield. And in it, he has his 10 principles for communities. And I can't quite get that into focus, but I will put this on the resource list for the students because it's exactly what you say. This is a really good manifesto. Yeah, that's really been helpful to me. And I think that's a question that actually came up in a conference once, was what's the difference between project management and communities of practice? And I think you just did a great job explaining that. I had a question I wanted to follow up on too about that if you had to start a new KM program, the place you would start would be communities of practice, and that you'd be happy to debate that with anybody. So my question is, have you put that out there on the SICOM list?
No, but I remember bringing it up at one of the companies I worked at. I was going to talk to essentially the person that was in charge of knowledge management, who at the time believed that expertise location was the most important thing. And all the resources were being put into that. And my point about that was that although expertise location can be a useful function, you don't have to have it because communities allow you to expose expertise at the time of need. They emerge from the community. So I'd say rather than investing in building an expertise location tool, if you have a community program that's successful, expertise will emerge from need, right? So if I say, who knows about X, I can ask the community and the expert will come forward. I don't need a skills inventory, it'll become apparent. And then if you say, well, how do you know that they're an expert? Well, if all of the people who are specialized in that topic are in that community, you can't get away with anything other than knowing your stuff. If you try to pretend that you know something you don't, everyone else in that field will
Well, no.
see that, right? So it's pretty self-policing. That's the beauty of communities. They self-police. They don't have to worry about too much about things going wrong in them. They sometimes do, and the community manager plays a role in that. But usually, you don't have to do much. In all the years that I've managed the SICAM community, I haven't really had to do that much in terms of that because if you do something that the community doesn't approve of, that becomes its own remedy. So one of the other principles that I think is really important in there is that communities need to be unique. You don't want redundancy in communities. And this is something that often gets violated in organizations because they'll think we'll have one for every possible variation and you lose all the power of it. So I like to give the example of a community that existed when I was at Deloitte for social media. We had Yammer as our collaboration tool, and anyone could create a Yammer group, and they did. And we had a proliferation of them. And some people believe that's a good thing. They'll say, let 1,000 flowers bloom and let the survival of the fittest and the best community will thrive and the other ones will die off. And won't that be great? And I say, no, that doesn't work that way. What ends up happening is if you have 10 different social media Yammer groups, as we did at one time at Deloitte, they'll all die because no one will know which one to join. You won't
Right.
have all of the people in the same place. They'll be all split up and fragmented. You'll get no critical mass. And critical mass is one of the important concepts of knowledge management.
All right, we've got a little frozen screen here. Let's wait just a second, see if it straightens out.